Hi, folks, and welcome back to day number 14 of the Bible in 365. Today we're taking a look at Genesis chapter 40, starting in verse 9, and going all the way till Genesis 42, ending in verse 28. Now let's get started. So our story continues in Genesis chapter 40. Here we learn that Joseph is overseeing the imprisonment of the cupbearer and the baker. Both of these officials of the king have dreams. One of them is positive, one of them is negative. Joseph is the conduit through which God interprets the dreams, and so he tells their meaning to each of these officials. To the cupbearer, he tells him that he will be restored to his place as the cupbearer for the king of Egypt. And he tells the baker that the baker is ultimately going to be impaled and his flesh will be eaten by the birds. Not great news. Upon telling these individuals the news, Joseph does tell the cupbearer that when he is restored to his place as the cupbearer for the king of Egypt, that he remembers Joseph and tells the Pharaoh that Joseph was wrongly imprisoned. The cupbearer forgets and does not tell the king. All right, so chapter 41 tells us that Pharaoh had two dreams. It tells us that he had a dream about healthy and weak cows, and then a dream about healthy and weak sheaves of grain. Pharaoh looks for someone to interpret these dreams. He calls all the wise men of Egypt. None of them are able to interpret his dream. At this point in time, the cupbearer to the king remembers Joseph, and remember that Joseph was able to give him a meaning of his own dream, and so he recounts this to Pharaoh. Pharaoh calls upon Joseph, tells Joseph his dreams. Joseph says, I cannot interpret them, but God will use me as a conduit and give you the meaning. So Joseph tells him that his two dreams have the same meaning, and that is that there will be 7 years of plentiful harvest for Egypt, followed by 7 years of famine. And that Pharaoh should put someone who is wise and discerning in charge of operations to prepare for the famine that ensues. And so Pharaoh thinks about it, and ultimately he decides to put Joseph in charge of Egypt. So we see that Joseph, just as he was elevated in Potiphar's house and just as he was elevated in the prison, he is now being elevated in all of the land of Egypt and becomes second in command only to Pharaoh. Pharaoh grants Joseph a wife, and this wife bears Joseph 2 sons. It tells us that around this time, Joseph is 30 years of age, and Egypt has the 7 years of plentiful harvest, and he goes around and starts collecting and storing up grain. In fact, it tells us that they had collected so much that Joseph stopped accounting for it because they couldn't keep track because there was so much. And then it tells us that the 7 years of famine come. So the 7 years of famine come, and the Egyptians are all crying out for food, and the people of other lands as well, because the famine was pretty widespread. At this point in time, Pharaoh says, go to Joseph and do what he tells you. And so Joseph opened up all the storehouses, and he sold grain to the Egyptians. Now, it doesn't tell us that he bought this grain originally. My guess was, like any good politician, Joseph seized the grain from the people, and now he's selling it back to them. But nevertheless, God uses that to provide for people. Continuing on to chapter 42. In chapter 42, we learn once again that because the famine is widespread, it has affected Joseph's own family. And so when Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, like, what are you doing? Like, why are you still here? Like, y'all are being lazy. Actually, like, do something. Take some initiative. Why am I having to be the one to tell you? Go to Egypt. You know, they've got grain. Go get some food for us so we don't die. And so they travel to Egypt. Now they arrive in Egypt and they come before Joseph, and Joseph recognizes them. They don't recognize him. He's grown up and changed quite a bit. And so it's at this point in time where he starts treating them harshly, questioning them, interrogating them. And he says, like, who are you? You're spies. You're spies. You have to be. And they said, no, we're not spies. We're just coming to get food for our family. And he's like, you lie. You're spies. And they're like, no, we're telling you the truth. And he's like, I'm going to, here's what you're going to do. I'm going to imprison all of you guys. You send one person home to get your younger brother and bring him here. And then we'll see if you're telling the truth, because you're lying and you're spies. And so Joseph ends up imprisoning all of them for 3 days. At the end of 3 days, only keeps one and sends the others back to their father. Now, at this point in time, before they leave, he fills up all of their sacks with grain and puts their money back. And so the brothers have traveled, and they stop for the night, and they see that their silver is returned. And they start questioning and freaking out, and they say, oh my God, what has happened? God, you surely are bringing down punishment and justice on us for our ill treatment of our brother Joseph. It's at this point in time where the brothers surely believe in karma, more or less. They were bad to their brother Joseph, and now they are paying for it. It is here in the middle of Joseph's brothers' journey back to their father that we end our reading for tonight. We'll pick back up tomorrow as we take a look at Genesis chapter 42, beginning in verse 29, and continue on to Genesis 45, ending in verse 15. As always, God bless.